And here we are, Henry Kaiser. We are looking forward to learning today just what kind of a person is able to design and lead a wartime workforce that consists of over 90,000 workers of very diverse ethnicities. These workers assembled warships that were almost 500 feet long. And they used to take over 200 days to complete one warship. Kaiser workers were able to finish assembling a ready-for-battle warship in just 4 days. It's just amazing. Who was the son of German immigrants that started his professional life as a helper working in a photography studio, and eventually greatly changed medical care for many of our citizens? We're fortunate today to have with us, my mic is not helping me, sorry, both Steve Gildord, a filmmaker and author and a consulting historian at Kaiser Permanente, and Lincoln Cushing, who I've been working with to put this together for the last few months, also an illustrator, an author, a political activist, and a former historian and archivist at Kaiser Permanente. So we'll start our conversation. Thank you very much for coming, and we enjoy putting these presentations together for you. And we're expecting it's going to be a great talk. So thanks again.
Thank you. And I look out at a sea of people who remember when we used to fight fascists instead of electing them. Okay, I was the Kaiser Permanente historian from 2011 to 2021. And my background did not lead me to know that I would end up being a corporate communicator. It's not quite part of my original job description. And so I entered this job thinking, okay, this is going to be interesting. Let's see what happens. And so the reason I'm giving this presentation, I usually give presentations about 20th century political posters and things like that with a bunch of slides. But I want to talk about Henry Kaiser as a role model. And these days, role models are really being questioned. It's a real challenge between Me Too and Cesar Chavez and a lot. The idea of who are heroes and what are they? And as I got into this, I sort of fell in love with this character who I would not expect to be supportive of. So I just wanted to jump into what this is about. I wanted to first dedicate this to 2 personal heroes from the World War II home front. One was my uncle, Robert F. Heiser, who was a professor at Berkeley, but he worked in the Kaiser Richmond shipyards as a steam fitter during the war. He also worked on the shipyard newspaper. And I want to dedicate this to Pat Perry, my mother-in-law, who was a WASP during World War II. She flew planes on the home front, and my lovely daughter just has a story in the Atlantic about her, so read all about it. But people don't know about the home front. You know, people know about World War II when they think about the battles. And the home front was where a lot of the rubber hit the road. And that's what Henry Kaiser was all about. So just the basics, you know, Henry J. Kaiser, Henry John Kaiser, born May 9th, 1882 in Sprout Brook, New York. His father and mother were from Germany, and he died in Hawaii in August 24th of 67. And he had a long litany of growth as, you know, in a profession. You know, he never really went to school. He worked his way through life. 1901, he worked in a photography studio. 1906, hardware and equipment sales in Spokane, Washington. 27, he was doing road building in Cuba, where I was born. In 31, he worked on Hoover Dam, which was a big deal. Hoover Dam was like a giant federal project. He worked on the Bay Bridge footings in 32. In 35, he worked on Grand Coulee Dam up on the Columbia River, which was a huge project. He got the second half of that contract to finish it off. 36, he worked on the Caldecott Tunnel. He finished off the Caldecott Tunnel after the original group pulled out because it was so problematic to build. 39, he worked on Shasta Dam. 40, he worked the Kaiser shipyards, and we're going to go into that in detail. 42, he built a steel plant in Fontana because we needed steel on the West Coast. 45, he opened up the Permanente healthcare plan to the public. We'll talk a little bit about that. 45, he also started the Kaiser Fraser Car Company because he just had to keep going with something. He owned Jeep from 53 to 1970, by the way. Those of you who like Jeeps, I've got a 48. And in 46, he had Kaiser Aluminum. For many years, he was one of the most preeminent American industrialists. You couldn't touch a product anywhere in the world that didn't have Kaiser Steel, Kaiser Gypsum, Kaiser Aluminum, Kaiser Tinfoil. He had participation at Disneyland. He was a major, major figure that almost nobody knows about today. And so why is that, and why does that matter? If he was a real jerk, I wouldn't care. But he wasn't a real jerk. He was a remarkable role model. So when I got hired as a corporate communicator, I thought, okay, here I am. I'm essentially behind enemy lines. I'm getting to be the mouthpiece for a major corporation. What's this going to be like? Am I going to be putting lipstick on a pig? No. I never was asked to do something I didn't believe in. And as a historian, my job was to promote employee engagement in the organization, which I did readily, and to help promote the brand. That was my job as a historian for Kaiser. And it was the whole organization, not just the healthcare plan, but also the deep history of the founders. And so I thought, okay, well, what am I going to discover as I work in this job? Well, first thing was, Henry Kaiser, a friend of labor, this major industrialist. So I tried to figure out what's the story behind that. In 1990, he was made a member of the Labor Hall of Fame by the Department of Labor. I'm going, Henry Kaiser, an industrialist. So I looked up the guy who led him into the labor movement, which was Harry F. Morton, his right-hand man in labor and in labor studies. At a 1943 convention during World War II, the AFL Metal Trades Department, here's Harry Morton talking about this. Kaiser was not always the idol of the working man. He was at one time as tough an employer as any in the United States, but everybody at Coulee Dam belonged to a union. And here's the interesting thing. We did not get religion just because we liked you people. I'm speaking of management now. We learned this. The cost per yard of concrete poured at Grand Coulee was less than it was per yard of concrete at Boulder Dam. The cheaper job was the closed shop, the union shop. The more expensive job was the open shop job. There's your beginning and reason for us getting religion, and when we got it, we went all the way. So I thought, okay, there's got to be more to this. So as I got into this, I kept finding more and more things about Henry Kaiser that made me think he was really not only a benevolent person, but an ethical and kind person. He was not a philanthropist. He didn't give a lot of money away. He built things that benefited the public. That was what he did. So I'm going to go for a prop here. Okay. The 7 Kaiser shipyards. They produce over 1,490 vessels, mostly cargo ships. They did some ships for the Navy. But mostly these were cargo vessels. These were getting the things from here to the war between 1941 and 1945. He actually started in 1940, building for the British before we were even at the war for the Lend-Lease program. He didn't know anything about building ships. I mean, his whole MO was, if there's a way to make money at it and you can get federal money, let's do it. And so he partnered with a shipbuilder and they started to build ships. Didn't know anything about building ships at all. But the reason for building these ships was huge, because it wasn't just the military vessels. The cargo vessels were crucial. I'm going to quote now from Hitler's right-hand man, Hermann Göring. "The tempo of your shipbuilding, for example, Henry Kaiser's program, surprised and upset us. We could not believe the speed with which your merchant marine was growing. Plans of 8 to 10 days to launch a ship seemed fantastic. Even when we realized it referred to the assembly of prefabricated parts, a mere 10 days to put it together was still unthinkable. Our shipbuilding industry was very thorough and painstaking, but very slow." So, kudos to Henry Kaiser from Hermann Göring. Another one of my heroes is Betty Reed Soskin, who just passed away this year at the tender age of 104. And some of you may know her as the oldest park ranger in the national parks. When she gave a speech for the Carrie McWilliams Lifetime Achievement Award, she had this to say about Henry Kaiser. "Only Henry Kaiser would dare to bring in a workforce of 98,000 black and white Southerners into a city with a population of 23,000. He did that not only because he knew he could revolutionize shipbuilding by introducing the mass production techniques Henry Ford used in the auto industry, but he knew where the greatest pool of available labor was in the country: the 5 southern states, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana. He brought people into a city who would not be sharing drinking fountains, schools, hospitals, housing, even cemeteries, any kind of public accommodations for another 20 years, back in their places of origin. That would not be happening until the 1960s. So Betty Reed Soskin gave kudos to Henry Kaiser. So let's look at the shipyard portion of this, because there's a lot of this history that we can't talk about, and we'll get filled in and we'll have questions, but the shipyards were an incredible period of time. Efficient production method, motivated workforce, high-quality healthcare. Those are the 3 pillars of what was going on in the shipyards. The efficient production methods included yards building from scratch. They didn't have 200-year-old shipyards that Germany was using to build. They built brand new shipyards, state-of-the-art, exactly how you want to build a shipyard in wide open spaces. Prefabrication methods, you don't just build a ship from keel to top, you put parts together. Welding versus riveting, and the introduction of the steel mill in Fontana to bring steel directly on the West Coast. The motivated workforce, urgency to end the war against fascism. I mean, everybody had skin in this game. We didn't want to lose this game. High-paying union jobs, equal pay was the law. Good employer-employee relations, first-time opportunities in the trades for many, and childcare was offered. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "What about the women?" He said, really good childcare. So all these parts were really brand new at the time. The massive output of the cargo ships from the Kaiser shipyards was essentially the Allied victory. It literally helped us to win the war. And you think about the workforce. And, in 1940, when he started to build ships for the British, well, the shipyard workers were often 2 and 3 generations old, white guys. They'd done this, they knew what they were doing. The war starts, these guys all go off to fight the war. The workforce turns upside down. Who's left to build ships? Who's left to build airplanes? Who's left to do anything? Who's left to pick the harvest? That's when we started the Bracero program, was bringing in workers from Mexico, because our guys were off fighting the war. The labor force in this country turned upside down. And Henry Kaiser had to realize what to do. Healthcare was also crucial. These were dangerous jobs. This was doing dangerous jobs under difficult circumstances by people who'd never done this. And so even though healthcare was required on a job for any company since 1913, they dramatically improved that. And we're going to talk about that transition. But it was based on occupational health. That was the law. Also, it was the pairing of Henry Kaiser and Sidney Garfield, and I'll talk a little bit about Sidney Garfield. But the 2 of these people brought something together that was just medical magic. So all of these parts contributed to making these shipyards incredible, and how they worked and their contribution to ending the war was crucial. So back to the labor relations, which is my field. We had the first cabinet member that was a woman, Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor. I mean, this woman was a dynamo, and she was FDR's right-hand woman, and she made sure that labor during World War II was as progressive as possible. Equal pay for women, imagine that, what a crazy idea. But race was a big deal too. So by federal law, the shipyards were closed shops, and they could only employ union members. Well, the Boilermakers Union, which was the biggest shipbuilding, wasn't too keen about this. They had a second two-tier system for black members. You could be a member, but you didn't have the same voting rights, you didn't have the same rights at all. You paid your dues, but you were not the same. And Henry Kaiser said no. He started to hire workers without going through the union because he was so angry with the union restrictions on hiring. Well, that got him in trouble with the unions, and it got him in trouble with the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor said, look, you've got to go through the unions for this. We got to do this the right way. But he was having fights with the unions about, I want to be able to hire anybody because we need to hire everybody. There was nobody who was not able to work in the shipyards. The only people that didn't work in the shipyards were Japanese Americans that were in internment camps. Everybody else, if you had a pulse, you could work in the shipyards. So the Boilermakers, I mean, this was a big fight. The Boilermakers' ability to get full access to employment didn't end until the war was almost over. It was a legal fight at the Bechtel shipyards at Sausalito. And the Boilermakers said, we're going to go on strike if you don't treat us better. It wasn't at the Kaiser shipyards, it was at the Bechtel shipyards. But the war was basically over by the time that they won that right. Women had to fight, they had to picket the union to get accepted into the union. They had to sit in at the Boilermakers Union in San Francisco and say, you've got to hire us. And they said, okay, we'll hire you. But this was not a slam dunk. People had to fight for their right to do defense industries. I mean, I've got an Oakland Tribune article, 1942, October 21. Kaiser stands firm on Negro decision. Because he was hiring black people, and the union was saying no. Talk about industrial relations being upside down. The industrialist capitalist was hiring black people, and the union was saying don't. So this was an important period in understanding how labor history really can come back and forth. He also supported the people that worked on the ships. These, as I said, these were mostly cargo vessels that were operated by the Merchant Marine, not by the Navy. So merchant mariners had a whole different track. They suffered the highest per capita casualty rate of any division during World War II, more than the Marines, the Navy, the Army. So they suffered a lot. They were on ships that got blown up. They were on ships that got captured. And so how do you support those workers? Well, you have a service organization for them. So the United Seamen's Service was created in August 8th of 1942 by the Warshipping Administration to provide for the facilities for the rest, recreation, and safety of the seafarers. Eventually, more than 125 locations worldwide were established. It was turned over to private operation ownership in 1942. Henry Kaiser was the first president. He stepped up. He said, we got to care for the workers that are running these ships. So what did that mean? Well, okay, so he wasn't just supporting those workers. There's also a racial dimension as well. January 1943, the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, included this in their article. United Seamen's Service is outstanding in that the setup makes no provision for discrimination because of race or creed. With the existence of separate USO centers within the Army camps and separate canteens for white and Negro sailors and soldiers, the action of the United States Seamen's Service presents a lesson in practical democracy that may well be copied by many other groups, including the United States Navy, Army, and Marine Corps. So again, he got shout out by the NAACP during the war for doing the right thing. So let's get to the health plan, which is really the gem of all of this. And what's left in all of this. Just for those of you who don't know, the Permanente in Kaiser Permanente comes from the name of a creek in Cupertino that generally flows year-round, although it doesn't always. We've taken people there and it's been dry, it's sort of embarrassing. But Henry had a quarry and cement plant there and had a little shack on this creek. And when they were setting up a foundation to support the hospitals, his wife, Beth, said, well, let's call it Permanente. That's a good name. So that's where the name comes from. So the health plan during the war was, Henry Kaiser's building these ships, and at first, the industrial health care covers the workers in the shipyards. It's not a lot of workers, but all of a sudden, when the labor force turns upside down, and the shipyards are growing hugely, they had 4 shipyards here, 7 in the Pacific Northwest. Well, this is a lot of workers. How do you care for them? You need a health care plan to cover them, not just industrial health care. But it starts off as industrial health care, and this is what people don't understand. I didn't understand this till recently. Industrial health care is what was the basis for the health plan we know now. You're all covered, by the way, if you're a worker. If you get injured on the job, the first question they ask you at the ER is, did this happen on the job? Whole separate track of care because it's covered by workers' comp. So it's been legally required since 1913. And when Henry Kaiser, when he was building Grand Coulee Dam, and the workers, it was an isolated remote site with a hospital, Henry Kaiser brought in Sidney Garfield, who had done similar work on the Colorado River Aqueduct project in Southern California, said, we need to provide good care for the workers. Because good care for the workers means the workers show up the next day. Henry Kaiser wasn't a philanthropist. He said, look, I want my workers to show up to work every day. This is practical business. And so he brought in this guy who he heard did really good stuff with workers. They fixed up this hospital. It was really a model. And the care was so good at this remote site that the union said, well, can you start to cover our families here? We've got some families who are living here. I said, sure, why not? And they scratched their head and came up with, let's throw out 50 cents a week. So Henry Kaiser and Sidney Garfield had done similar work like this on this remote job site, Grand Coulee Dam. Well, Henry Kaiser comes down here and he's starting to build ships, and all of a sudden, this job explodes. And he's doing this for a lot of people who need care. So these 2 children of immigrants set up a healthcare plan to care for these workers. The basic goal was to keep people on the job. And it was later extended to their workers, and not just to the workers on the job, but if you want to get care for falling down at that party you went to that night, you're not covered by workers' comp. So for 50 cents a week, you could be covered to do this. So that distinction between industrial care and non-industrial voluntary plan care is really crucial in understanding this. And this plan outlived the shipyards as we know it today. So here I'm going to quote historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. Kaiser and Garfield succeeded against all odds because of a passionate belief in what they were doing, and a commitment to one another, a spirit of innovation, and a sense of mission. And that really does describe Henry Kaiser. So the timeline for the healthcare plan in the shipyards was 42, January 42, he recruits Garfield to come on down to implement a plan to care for the workers. Nobody quite knew how much bigger this was going to get. By March of 42, he's responsible for the industrial medical service at Todd, Cal, and Kaiser shipyards. They build a hospital, a 70-bed hospital, Fabiola Hospital, and then this was in August of 42. Later in August, the Richmond Field Hospital opened up. So there's this whole system of triaging. You've got the first aid stations at the shipyards. You've got the Richmond Field Hospital here, and then a real hospital in Oakland. And there was a similar thing going on in the Pacific Northwest. The voluntary non-industrial healthcare plan opens up to workers in August of 42, and by August of 43, the plan's open to family members. Because If your wife is sick and you don't feel like you can go to work, that check's not getting bid. So all of the healthcare plan had a practical purpose. It wasn't benevolence, it made sense as an industrial care. And on March 30 of 1945, before the war is over, the Permanente Foundation Health Family Plan continuation is opened to employees of the yard. You didn't have to be working in the yard anymore to be able to continue with this plan. And of course, it was instantly attacked by private medical practice and the AMA. So this whole stuff was, nobody had a healthcare plan. I mean, healthcare plans were not common. This was unknown. So the care for these workers opened up all these different layers of what does it mean to be in a healthcare plan. It used to be that you save your money and go, well, I'm afraid to go see the doctor because I don't have money. You're on a healthcare plan. All of a sudden you go in, it doesn't cost you anything. So this was a huge change in how Americans could begin to understand what healthcare was all about. It began to be a plan, not just you going to see a private practice physician. And again, Henry Kaiser didn't invent this, but he perfected it. There had been a program called Ross Luce Healthcare in Southern California. It was the first sort of effort at trying to do something like this for a group of people. But what happened in the shipyards made this explode. I've got a prop. This book, Disabled Workers. Okay, you think about the shipyard workforce, okay? They were hiring anybody with a pulse, literally. Well, if you were too disabled to go into the war, or if you came back from the war, you could get a job in the shipyards because there was a place for you. The jobs were more dangerous than serving on the front lines. More than 2 million disabling industrial injuries happened every year during the war. This was a huge problem. And please turn off your phone. So in 1944, the Kaiser Foundation Hospitals and the War Manpower Commission published a huge tome, 627 pages, outlining every single job in the shipyards and what you could do, how to do it. Did you need to hear very well? Did you need to see very well? Did you need legs? Every job in the shipyard had a place for you. Well, this was great. This was the beginning of the modern disability rights movement. At the end of World War II, in October of '45, there was a conference held in San Francisco, Work for Handicapped Veterans. Government agencies, the AFL-CIO, they all got involved in saying, what do we do with all our returning workforce who are disabled? And so Henry Kaiser was really on board with making it possible for everybody to get a job in the shipyards. And so this describes every single job in the shipyards. The triaging facilities of setting up all these places where how do you get healthcare fast, quickly in the shipyards? They kept expanding and expanding. They had to keep building. The Oakland Hospital kept blowing up more and more. They had to keep building and building and building because they didn't have facilities. Medical research happened during World War II. It wasn't like they quit doing this just to put Band-Aids and then made splints for people with broken legs. They were continuing to do quality medical research under the circumstances. How do you deal with people with pneumonia? Well, without penicillin, you had a hard time fighting it. Maury Collin, who was one of our founding physicians, was doing such good work at treating pneumonia with what he could that he got the first civilian doses of penicillin, and it was a miracle drug. But it's because of the work he was doing in the shipyard, taking care of those workers, that he was allocated pneumonia. It had been going to the military before then. And so,
I'll tell you one thing about that pneumonia. It went to a little girl, and pneumonia, penicillin was so rare that they actually took her urine and removed the penicillin from it so that it could be given to someone else. It was that rare.
No, it was really rare, and the physician work that was being done to try to treat people and to do the best they could was, medical advances that they were publishing in medical journals during World War II. Another element of all of this is non-discrimination. Like I said, the only people who weren't working in the shipyards were those Japanese Americans who were interned. The workforce, because it was open to everybody, an estimated 20,000 African Americans, along with many Chinese Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos, worked in the Kaiser shipyards. The civil rights movement was just coalescing. Racism in America was still very prevalent, and access to health care was no exception. Black people could not just go into a lot of healthcare facilities. The Permanente Foundation hospitals took the high road. Here's a quote from a journalist about the healthcare plan in 1943. Illness knows no color here. Red-helmeted men, women welders, Negroes lined up for a checkup by the busy young doctors. The idea that you could get health care regardless of your race was pretty much unheard of. This was a huge thing, and for a lot of black people, this was like the first time they'd had access to a hospital health care. Women's health, like I said, women were working in the shipyards. Well, the shipyards hired a gynecologist, Hannah Peters. There were about 23,000 female employees. You need to make sure that they know how to take the right vitamins, salt tablets, how to wear the right gear. They were doing training so that they could work safely. In 1 year, Hannah Peters saw over 2,800 new cases in the gynecology department at the Richmond Field Hospital, including 390 cases of gonorrhea. A high percentage of infected women led physicians to introduce an outreach program in the shipyards. So it's all these things that you don't think of as a home front healthcare program, but because of how labor and everything was upside down, they were treating people in a way that led to improvements in healthcare for Americans. So I'll just get to post-war now. Housing. I mean, Henry Kaiser continued in many ways to promote housing for ordinary people. He believed in prefabricated housing, just like he believed in prefabrication as a tool for shipbuilding. And so he did a whole program for helping get affordable housing for GIs after the war. Cars. I'm a gearhead. I like cars. But he got into the car market. The Henry J was the lowest priced new car on the market. He wasn't interested in building these fancy cars with lots of chrome and fills. He was proud of building the lowest priced entry car, because he wanted GIs to be able to afford this. People weren't building cars during the war. There was a glut of interest in saying, we want cars after the war. And the price tag was less than $1,200 for a car. So I'm going to end here because Steve's got a lot to say, but these are the reasons why I've come to believe that this fellow, Henry J. Kaiser, who has gotten very little knowledge and credit now, people don't know who he was really a mensch. He was just somebody who just did good stuff, not because he had to, but because he felt it was the right thing to do. And time after time again, he stepped into doing things in a way that was what was best for the American people, not what's going to make him a lot of personal money. He was just, a really fantastic fellow, and I think he deserves credit as a role model, as an American citizen, as an industrialist. So I will end there and turn it over to Steve.
People often accuse biographers of falling in love with their subject. And that's the case. That was my case. I looked desperately for the other side of Henry Kaiser. I found a couple things, but they weren't really very serious. But people talk about his energy. They often talk about his energy. And I had a diagnosis from his nurse, who was also his wife, the second wife, that he was, my words have lost me, where you have ups and downs. Bipolar, he was bipolar. But what's interesting about him was that his highs were not really high. They gave him a lot of energy though. And his lows were not terribly low. His low consisted of staying in bed for a couple of days with the phone constantly going and people coming and talking to him and all. That was his low. I also became interested in his early life. One of the things that happened in his early life, I think this is, no other biographer, as far as I know, has yet to pick up on this, but he was building roads in British Columbia, and the Lusitania was sunk with lots of Americans, British and Canadians on board. Vancouver, where he was, went crazy. They attacked the German bakeries. They attacked the German clubs, butchers, all that kind of thing. And Henry Kaiser, what's his name? Kaiser, who is leading the German country at that time? Kaiser. What he did, first of all, was he sent his family back to the United States, back to Washington State. The second thing he did was he finished his job, and then he got out of there. Now, later on, he used the phrase patriot in pinstripes. Later on, I think he was getting a special satisfaction out of being so important to him, the American defense. He was showing he was a real American. And I think that was a lot, I think that was part of what made him the man that he was. Let's see, trying to think of some other parts that, I located that little hospital in the desert that Sidney Garfield had founded that led to his meeting Henry Kaiser. It was down in the desert in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. The place was gone now, and the work camp that was with it was gone now, but I found the foundation of it. So I brought back little pieces of the foundation. So I said, here's the foundation of the Kaiser Foundation. I have a terrible time with not avoiding any time it's a chance to do wordplay. I also found Sidney Garfield's nurse. She was the first nurse that was hired. She's like the grandmother or godmother of all the nurses in Kaiser today. And she was wonderful in giving me descriptions of what life was like out there in the desert. One picture that I think typifies what life was like out there is Sidney Garfield and Betty Runyon, the nurse, sitting on the steps of this little tiny wood frame hospital. And he has a rifle at his shoulder. And what's turning out he's doing, according to Betty, was they would set up the big glass bottles that the Ringer solution came in, and they'd set up cans, and they'd sit on the front steps of the hospital. And they would plink for an afternoon. There aren't many hospitals where you can do that. That little hospital was one of the first. I'm going to say, we'll go back to Henry Kaiser for a minute. He was convinced that by doing good, you could do well. That was part of it. And something about shipbuilding. He delighted in telling other shipbuilders, referring to to the pointy end of the ship and things like that. It drove them crazy. But what he said about building ships was, it's just a reverse dam. You're keeping the water out. We can do that. But before they went to make their proposal to the British, who wanted to build ships in America because they couldn't build them fast enough in Great Britain, he had his men go to the New York Library and get out books and start teaching themselves about shipbuilding. We talk about Rosie the Riveter, but in the shipyards, as some of you know, they did welding. Now, welding changing from riveting to welding is a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that you no longer have to drill holes in these plates, make sure that they match the holes in the plate they're going to be attached to. If they don't, then you have to ream them out. Then you take rivets and that have been heated red hot, and you toss them, and a bucker holds a plate behind where the rivet's going, and the riveter slams it with a hammer to turn it into a mushroom shape to hold those two plates together. One of the things you're doing there is you're making an overlap, and that means you're using extra steel. And aside from the fact that steel was hard to get, it increased the weight of the ship. And so if Kaiser could, the more welding they could do and replace with riveting, that was something that Kaiser was interested in. And they did, and each ship, as they moved along, they got to use less and less rivets and more. I think when they got to the end, it was about 2,500 rivets, I think, as opposed to about 250,000 that had been on a welded ship. I had something else in mind.
So for those of you who have not been out to the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Park, you've got to go.
And I would say when you go, you should also make sure that you visit the Red Oak Victory.
Right.
The only way you can really understand what it's like to build one ship is to get on this one and get lost. And when you start looking at little things on that ship, that everything on that ship had to be put on had to be put on.
Also, at the Red Oak Victory, you can see what's called a whirly crane, which is a giant crane that will swivel around and roll on a track. So it's very mobile. And when you see some of the pictures of the construction of these ships, where they were building these ships with welding, you were talking about welding, I weld, and it's a lot easier to weld down than up. And they understood that in the shipyards. And so very often they'd build these superstructures upside down. You'd build it with a ceiling on the floor and you work your way up, and then a giant crane will take that, or two cranes, and put it onto the ship, onto the rest of it. So the use of the whirly crane was crucial in putting these ships together, and those came down from Grand Coulee Dam. And so you can see both the Red Oak Victory and the whirly crane, but it's not immediately adjacent to the Rosie the Riveter Park. But the Rosie the Riveter Park is really, really important, not just because it's one of the main parks in this country that tells the Homefront story, but it tells a lot of what was going on in Richmond and the impact of the war on Richmond. And that's where Betty Reed Soskin was giving tours. It's a model for national parks in this country.
One of the things Betty Soskin pointed out was that that other union that was formed for the minorities,
the auxiliaries,
the auxiliary union, they had to develop their own leadership. And that leadership became the core of the civil rights movement after the war. So that's another reason why the shipyards have played such a role in the Bay Area history. The other thing that she pointed out was, and that's true, that she said, people tend to think of the life in the shipyards as everybody getting together and arm in arm marching toward victory. He said it wasn't like that. He said there were the Irish didn't like the Italians, and nobody liked the Okies, and there was a book written by a sociologist who was a brand new PhD at Berkeley, and she went to work in the shipyards, and what she did was she ended up writing a book about the social status of people in there. It's a remarkable book and an eye-opening book for many people.
I just remembered something that's helpful to understand this, which is we're talking about Henry Kaiser getting religion about doing the right thing. When he worked at Hoover Dam, he was part of a consortium, and he was basically providing the concrete. And this was his first giant, big federal project. And things did not go well. There were terrible labor relations, there were strikes by the IWW, and there were occupational hazards. They were cutting corners by using giant trucks in the tunnels that were internal combustion engines, and they were supposed to be using electric trucks, and they didn't. And people came down and died with carbon monoxide poisoning. And I think that Henry Kaiser felt a real stink about that. That really troubled him, that there was this, effort at, well, how do we save some money? How do we go faster, but with a consequence on the workers that I think stuck with him. And so it wasn't just pressure from the unions to get it together when he was doing Grand Coulee Dam. It was this experience that he'd had at Hoover Dam. So I think that at every step of the way, he sort of learned some lessons, and he listened to people. He listened to Eleanor Roosevelt when she said, what are you going to do about child care? He was very open about ideas that made sense. And so it was just sort of incredible when you follow his professional trajectory along. He had a low tolerance for corruption and greed. When he was working in Cuba, he did not like the notion that he had to pay all these people off. He said, no, I don't want to do this. He was just a subcontractor, but that offended him. So he really had an ethical standard that stuck with him throughout his entire life.
However, the workforce at Hoover was fired. They wanted to go on strike. He said, not he said. He was spending most of his time in Washington, D.C. as the liaison between 6 companies, the consortium that was building the dam. And so he wasn't really he wasn't really to blame for it, but
no.
But he when they just threw everybody out, there were lots of people at the gates who hadn't had jobs in years, and so it was not hard for them to rehire to cover the jobs that were now available.
And so the tail end of a lot of this stuff has to do with, here we have this American industrialist who forms this healthcare plan for his workers and then opens it up to the public and is instantly attacked by the medical establishment. The American Medical Association is trying to get dirt on this low-quality worker care, and he was branded as offering socialized medicine. He said, no. This is the best plan you can have under capitalism. If you don't do what I've got, you're going to get nationalized health care. And, politically, you could make a case that because of the success of the Kaiser healthcare plan and the Permanente plan and unions jumping on board, unions saved the plan for the first few years because they jumped on board. Harry Bridges said, we want you to sign up the ILWU. All of the ILWU. They had to build hospitals in Southern California. They had to contract with groups in Oregon and Washington. All of a sudden, they've got these workers that they had to provide for, but because they were seen as so labor-friendly, Henry Kaiser was seen as sort of socialized medicine, and it galled him to be branded socialized medicine. He said, you don't get it. If you don't do this, you're going to get that. But it's an incredibly efficient marriage of a nonprofit plan to run the hospitals and physicians who contract specifically with those hospitals. So
this did not happen easily.
No.
In the 50s, in the early 50s, when they were being attacked viscerally by organized medicine. I always think that's funny because organized medicine isn't as organized as Kaiser Permanente. But when they were being attacked by there was an internal struggle going on. Henry Kaiser was taking the view that I provide the workplace, you, the doctors, come in and you work there. So I have a lot to say about what you do. So in providing health care, the problems are how do you match the business side to the care side and have that provide a high quality care. Well, there was a real struggle within Kaiser Permanente of how that was going to happen. And it almost closed. The doctors said, if we can't deal with our patients without interference, then we're going to go someplace else. And it was looking pretty grim at that point. Henry Kaiser called everybody to come together to his Lake Tahoe vacation home. And they sat down and they hammered out the beginnings of an agreement. And I think that's what makes Kaiser Permanente really special, is they have this history, and they have this history of solving their problems, not by resorting to idealism, but resorting to reality, what really works. And now, Cecil Cutting, one of the founding members, said, because the Permanente Medical Group is separate from the Kaiser Foundation hospitals and Kaiser Health Plan. Cecil Cutting said the thing he was proudest of was he got rid of the hyphen that used to go between them because they're now one agency. That having tied together so well the financial side and the care side, Kaiser has been able to grow and expand and say, we provide really good health care, and we do it at a reasonable cost. At one point, they wanted to be the low cost in the market, and years ago they changed that. Now they want to be a mid. They don't see themselves as a commodity anymore. They see themselves as a service, and that makes a big difference in how you organize and how you plan, and how the two parts deal with each other.
One unintended consequence of the medical establishment beating up on the health plan at the beginning was they didn't allow physicians to have privileges at many hospitals. And so Kaiser said, okay, I'll just build my own. And he built state-of-the-art, brand new, world-class hospitals because he had to. I mean, when they went into the Colorado region, 2 of the 4 hospitals said, we won't let you physicians work here. So it's one of these things where, because he was a builder, he said, okay, great, we'll build a hospital. And so it's just one of these things where at every step of the way when, what's his expression, problems are just opportunities when we're close. He just pick himself up and keep going and had a smile on his face till he died.
One of the Kaiser Steel executives told me the story of he was going to a meeting in Fontana, and Henry Kaiser happened to be there, and he said, "Good morning, boys. How are you doing?" And they all said, "Just fine, boss." And afterwards, they came out of that meeting and looking rather tired. It had been a tough meeting. And he said, "Well, how'd it go?" And he said, "Well, boss, you gave us a lot of opportunities."
Or you want to open it up to questions now?
Sure.
There must be some questions,
Somebody-
so why don't we do this? Thank you.
It's like somebody's coming down with a collection.
It's the collection plate.
Yeah.
Be generous. Thank you,
Yeah.
Steve.
Oh, that was fun. You know, when I used to go to the, I used to go down to the shipyards. This was before I got really interested in the health plan. And I would go around, I would talk to people and ask what different things were that were still there. And at one point I came across a whirly crane. And the guy said, I think this was used in the shipyards. So
Okay,
so I went and looked up the manufacturer's plate, and I called the manufacturer who was still in business, and I said, can you tell me anything about this crane? And he said, well, I'll have to go back into our archives. That's from quite a while ago. And then he told me this crane had helped build and sent down to work in the shipyards. So it was doubly historic. And that's the one that's now next to the Red Oak Victory.
you want to talk about Kaiser Permanente and how because he had a disabled son?
Oh, yeah. I forgot what the disease was.
I think a muscular dystrophy.
Yeah, I think you're right. During the war, Henry Kaiser Jr. Was working very hard, and they thought that the symptoms that he was showing were really from overwork and stress. But it became clear that it must be something more, and we got a diagnosis of that it was muscular dystrophy. Henry Kaiser immediately set out to find out what he could learn about muscular dystrophy and how it could best be treated. He went to the author of Kaiser Wakes the Doctors, de Cruyff. He went to de Cruyff, who was one of the most popular authors of that period, especially on medical subjects, and looking for something that could be done. They found someone who was doing things with promise, and in order to get him to come to Kaiser, they built him a hospital, which is now the Kaiser Foundation Research Center in Vallejo. And it's open. It's now one of the best rehabilitation places in the world. People come from all over the world there, but it started out as a father trying to do something best for his son.
Here's what I think is a simple question. I want to get to all of these. These are great, and no question unturned. Were women and men paid equal wages for equal work? Technically, yes, but not all women got the same kind of jobs. Very often women would get an entry-level job, so they couldn't discriminate legally on, for equal job categories. But it doesn't mean that, a woman could rise to a higher position, but women were generally coming into the lower level positions. There were also women who were draftspeople, there were women working on the shipyard newspaper, there were women working in all sorts of capacities in the shipyard besides actually fabricating a ship. And so there were, but those positions, a man and a woman working side by side in the same job classification were legally required to get the same pay. Thank you, Francis Perkins. Okay, let's see. Okay. Did the government allow Kaiser to destroy health workers after the war, thereby undermining any effort of former workers to sue Kaiser for known health issues like asbestos after their employment? I don't know about destroying.
I know a little bit about this. The records were stored in the basement of a building in Oakland, and it flooded, and so a long time ago, not terribly long after the war. And
No. It's also true that the medical evidence that I've been able to find so far, and again, there's a lot we don't know about history, but the biggest danger, the exposure to asbestosis, was not in the shipbuilding, it was in the ship breaking. So right after the war, as these ships started to come back, were being torn apart, they were torn apart at Zidell shipyards up in the Pacific Northwest in Portland. And when you're tearing the stuff apart is when this stuff was really, people were exposed. And they didn't quite think about it as carefully.
Also, it wasn't known how...
It wasn't as known, but they did know some. It's like cigarette smoke and lead and gas. They did know enough to know that there should be more protection. But the ship breaking was much more, released a lot more particulates, which is what you've got to breathe. We have an expert here on asbestosis poisoning, which is my wife, because she was in a court case. But the breathing of this stuff is what really causes the most damage for 99% of the time. And it was the ship breaking. So I'm sure that there were workers exposed to asbestos during the construction of the ships, but the evidence is that most of the exposure was after the fact. And it's terrible. It's a consequence of rushed construction during war and after the war. Kaiser Center office building complex, Lake Merritt. I was archivist there from 1990 to 2016. Original headquarters of Kaiser Aluminum. People know that the giant, beautiful curved building facing Lake Merritt. Had a post office, dry cleaner, shoe repair. That's now owned by PG&E. They bought that building a couple of years ago.
That's interesting because they were the first client to move into the building.
Yeah. But that building was a beautiful building. And there's a tunnel from that building underneath the road to the Ordway building. People don't know about that.
Yeah.
But I've actually been in that tunnel that carried big stuff because there's no real loading dock at one of the buildings.
It's the Kaiser Center.
Kaiser Center. So they had to go stuff through this tunnel to there. But those buildings were proudly built with Kaiser materials. Kaiser steel, Kaiser gypsum, Kaiser aluminum. And there was, I've got a lot of materials about the building of both of those buildings. And now that building.
That building, the Ordway building, was going to look a lot different.
Yeah.
I interviewed the architect of that building, and he told me that when he was working with Kaisers, that he was told, just go ahead and do, make the building you want to make. And he said, well, it's going to be more expensive than you think. He said, don't worry, I'll get the board to agree to it. The board didn't agree to it, and the plan came down, and the new building, the one that's there, he designed. And but it was very interesting to hear what the plan was.
There's a question here about after the war, and a lot of the workers that came here, a lot of the workers of color that came here to both Oakland and to Richmond, and then what happened after the war, and sort of what responsibility did Henry Kaiser feel for that. One challenge was right after the war, when shipbuilding was done, and there was no need for any more ships. It caused Henry Kaiser a lot of pain to see this giant, highly efficient industry stop because there was simply no need for more ships. There was a little bit of ship repair, which you could only do in one of the shipyards at Kaiser Richmond because it has dry docks. The others, you can't drag a ship back up on land. You've got to do it in a dry dock. And there's only some, what they call graving basins or dry docks. Yeah. So ship repair was just not really a practical problem. And so they basically had to drop the shipbuilding. And also Henry Kaiser was getting into the auto building.
There's something else. In going through the Bancroft, some of the Bancroft holdings, I came across correspondence between Henry Kaiser and the government about this issue and Henry Kaiser he thought he could build maybe aircraft there, maybe buses. He had a number of ideas that he could do in the shipyard, and he had contracts. This correspondence was about him writing, saying, you have to tell me whether you can give me a lease, because if you don't, until I get that, I can't take on these contracts, because then I'll be responsible with no place to do the work. And the final letter is, if I don't hear from you by such and such a date, I will assume that you are not going to give me that lease. And so that's how the shipyards became. And that's why we have a Rosie the River National Park there now, because nothing was done after the war to modernize it. And
Kaiser Industries did keep some of those buildings, and there was some Kaiser Industries work being done into the 60s there. But Henry Kaiser he was building cars in Michigan at an old former plant, and his life was changing. He married his second wife with the blessing of his first wife, and he soon moved to Hawaii. He preferred Hawaii. It was just where he ended up.
Well, his son wanted to get him out of the way because he wanted to take over.
Yeah.
He'd been second fiddle for long enough. And when he went, and you know what he did when he retired and went to Hawaii, he built a housing development, he built a mall, and he built
geodesic dome.
Oh yeah, he built it. I built a geodesic dome once. I was doing a show.
Raise your hand if you.
I was doing a show with Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah.
And I got to do it. Anyway, he built this Hawaiian Village hotel, which is now, I've forgotten who's operating it, one of the major, it might be Hilton. But that became a destination. It changed Americans' vacation habits, actually.
So the question here about Betty Reed Soskin commenting about integration and lack of it during the war. And, even though Kaiser was hiring everybody, it doesn't mean that the actual on-the-job workforce was really very integrated. As Steve pointed out, people would tend to sort of hang out with the kind of people that they knew and liked, and you couldn't mandate integration. You could make the opportunities for it to happen, and there were certain circumstances where I've read where there was great labor solidarity between races and colors, but people were basically, this was a job. You're showing up, you're doing this, you're trying to make sure that you build these ships right, and rubbing elbows with other people, you were exposed to people, doesn't necessarily mean that you were integrated. But this is the very beginning for a lot of people of actually working with people from other races and even with women. So it was a beginning, but it was just a beginning. And like I said, it wasn't until Bechtel, the lawsuit Bechtel shipyards in Sausalito, where the two-tiered structure of the Boilermakers was crushed. And in the military, it took the giant explosion at Port Chicago to where the black sailors refused to go back because they were handling munitions without training. And so this court case integrated the military. I mean, at all levels, there was still the struggle for fighting for integration. And the shipyards, the Kaiser shipyards, were a really good step in the right direction, but it was just the beginning of it. Okay, given how successful the Kaiser healthcare model has been, do you have any thoughts about why this model has not been successfully replicated elsewhere? The only other Kaiser model I know is Harvard Health Plan, which failed. I mean, there's different elements of this. Part of it is the healthcare plan was was invited to other states, like it got invited to Ohio, and worked well for a while there, and then slowly collapsed. It's a company of ideas as to why this doesn't work everywhere.
It's an extremely interesting interesting question. They tried a number of different ways. There was one in Texas that was a hybrid between an insurance company and the Kaiser Health Plan. As I mentioned earlier, that linking together of the physicians and the foundation was possible because of Kaiser's history up to that point. And other places don't start with that history. So there is a working health plan in Georgia. There's one in mid-Atlantic, up by Washington. There's and then Colorado. But none of them are really like Kaiser. They're not built totally on that model because it doesn't work there. But it has failed in some other places, like you said, Ohio and Texas. And I still don't have an answer, and I've read about this, and nobody, as far as I know, nobody has an answer that makes any sense.
There's a question about, did I understand correctly that Henry Kaiser said for equality for blacks and whites that have separate water fountains? No. I mean, I'll reread Betty Reed Soskin's quote there, which is, he brought people into a city who would not be sharing drinking fountains, schools, hospitals, housing, and even sanitaries, any kind of public accommodations for another 20 years. He didn't make that happen. That's the city of Richmond. In the shipyards, which is what he did have control over. He built a lot of the housing. He built a lot of the housing that was for the massive housing projects in Richmond, but he just built it, he didn't run it. So the only place that I ever saw Henry Kaiser tolerate any sort of segregation of facilities was at the Fontana Steel Mill. Apparently, the initial housing that they were building at the insistence of the workers there was segregated. I haven't seen any other evidence of him supporting any segregated facilities that I know of. Why no KKK with all these black workers showing up? Well, there actually were. I mean, there was a lot of racism going on. You can imagine a lot of these police were not happy with this. A lot of the story of racism and not just Klan, but just general human racism. I mean, there were black people being beat up after they leave a bar in Richmond. I mean, there was a lot of racism going on at the time, and this, in many ways, this exacerbated it, but there needs to be more research and writing and stories about this because that needs to be explored. I was having a hard time just understanding which hospitals existed in the Richmond area for these workers that were working for the shipyards before Kaiser showed up. I mean, what did a black worker do? What did a black worker do in Sausalito? Which hospital did you go to? Which hospital did you see? That information is still being teased out, but racism did not vanish. It was just, it was called out, and there were good examples and bad examples.
After the war, when the membership in Kaiser plummeted, the question was, could it survive? Could it build up afterwards? There were people within Kaiser who said, we can't have integrated facilities. It's going to keep out white people, and we want to grow. So the greatest good for the greatest number argument. Others said, no, we came here because this place had ideals that mean a lot to us, and we don't want to give them up. It was agreed to go to Henry Kaiser and ask for his opinion. And he asked the people who came in, do you treat a black person differently for the same disease? And they said no. They said, why would you then have separate facilities? He was really interested in efficiency. And said, why would you have separate facilities if you're going to treat them the same way. And he also said at another time, he said, if I was in a place where they were giving me medical care, and I was told there was another place, and it was just as good, but it was over there, but I belonged in this one. He said, I believe that that other place might be better than what I'm getting. And he said, so that's another reason not to do it. And there was a time when the head of the Oakland Fire Department came in to inspect the hospitals to see if he wanted to join his workforce to join. And he said it was really good, but he was a little concerned about there were black people in there. He said, can we make sure that our people are treated in an all-white section? And he was answered, I think you need to find another health plan.
Yeah. Now, I was trying to find evidence of the first African-American physician working in the hospitals. And because the health plan was run by Sidney Garfield, he was in charge of all hiring and firing. I mean, these were his people. And as it grew and grew and grew, it started to get more complex. And there was a whole period in the history of the organization where he ended up having to let go of that. And the Permanente Medical Group was formed in 1948. And the only information I've got about it, a known African-American physician working in the hospital, was at the Oakland Hospital in 1948, a physician who'd come out after the war. When you talk to the physicians, the early black physicians that came, their comments about racism weren't about working at the hospital, it was about getting housing. They couldn't buy a house. And I talked to 2 different children of physicians who were black who said, we had to do these workarounds. We had to have a proxy buy a house for us. So the housing was a problem. You think that, wow, I'm a doctor? Oh no, you can't buy a house here. So that was really sort of the top level concern about racism as a physician in the early health plan as a
Betty Soskin had to have someone buy a house for her.
Yeah, no, it's just, so that's the kind of stuff where you think about the dimensions of this. And I learned so much just doing this 10-year job. I loved it. It was, I got to run with it. I got to digitize the shipyard newspapers from the Portland area and from the Richmond area. And you read these shipyard newspapers, and they are like, wonderful exposures into what's going on, and here's better ways to weld, and here's what Frank did on his vacation. And it's like, it's a really homey thing. And my uncle worked on one of these newspapers. I thought, here I am. I'm a communicator for a major corporation, writing about my uncle, who was a communicator for a major corporation, the same corporation. So it was really an honor to do this job and to be able to work with people who were involved in the evolution of what is a major opening in what healthcare in America was, and that gets very little attention in this country. You read about the history of medicine in America, the Kaiser Permanente health plan gets very little traction. It's still it's not East Coast, it's worker health, it's got all these stinks about it that the conventional medical literature still, to this day, does not accept. So, I felt good at being able to sort of help to elevate that story. So does that help to explain why people should think highly of Henry J. Kaiser? Thank you.
Okay, just final words. Hi, I'm Ab Freiberg. I'm Ashby Village Executive Director, and I just really want to thank you, Lincoln and Steve. Amazing talk, elucidating, moving, and just really inspiring. And Irene, thank you for just putting this event together, and all the volunteers that helped, and thank you to Epworth Church for co-sponsoring the event and providing us with the space. For For the few of you here who may not know Ashby Village, we're a vibrant, caring community of older adults and volunteers from all backgrounds who are transforming how we age. And if you aren't already a volunteer or a member, come join us. Our programs are free of charge, and we make that possible so everyone can join. So if you're still here on Zoom, there's a link where you can donate, and you'll see a QR code as you exit that you can hit. Those of us in person can also donate. Okay, thank you very, very much.